All right, welcome to the idea of the university. I'm here with David McKerracher and Snelgrove. How did I pronounce that right?
Snelgrove with an
Snelgrove
N.
and
Yeah.
and Snelgrove, and we're here to talk about a course coming up by Theory Underground, titled "The Idea of the University," based on a book of the same name by Karl Jaspers. So, welcome here, David and Anne. Why don't you introduce yourself? Welcome to the channel.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here. I told Cadell maybe a week and a half ago, I'm humbled by the fact that he's been doing this for a lot longer than I have, actively online, building organic community around philosophy. And so I really respect that. And I think that it's what's needed, which is why I'm doing it as well. You know, Theory Underground looks to cultivate the kind of engagement and discussions that I wish I had had at the university in a lot of ways. And so this will be the first course that we do. And the reason that it's the first one for Theory Underground is because I kind of want to build a good foundation. So I'll talk a little bit more about everything later. But yeah, I'm David McKerracher. I have a master's in critical theory and alternative education from Boise State University. You can just call me Dave. Previously, I went by Theory Plebe online, so people still call me Plebe sometimes. And yeah, it's an honor to be here.
All right. Hello, my name is Anne Snelgrove. I also graduated from Boise State with a bachelor's of science in social science. So sociology was kind of my main focus. I did a lot of research at the university about neoliberal higher education. And so it kind of plays right into the idea of the university. I also was lucky enough to get to help develop and teach a course at Boise State last year called University Foundations 100 Is College Worth It? Outside of that, though, I've known Dave for 4.5-ish years. We are engaged. So not only do I just support Dave because I'm your partner, but because I genuinely believe in the goal of the Theory Underground and making education and philosophy more accessible to a lot of people. So yeah, I'm also happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, welcome both of you. And maybe we should start off with like the origin of Theory Underground. What is Theory Underground, and what are your visions and plans for it as you develop, of course, with the idea of the university being a foundational course as a part of the larger work.
Sure, yeah. Oh God, you know, this is actually going to be the first time that I've done this on someone's platform. So I've actually kind of, so far, I think in the launch and in the blog posts that I'd written about the name change and everything like that, I don't focus on the long-term vision or plan, because that's part of the point of the name change, was to actually lower the stakes in a sort of sense, because prior to Theory Underground, it had been New Symbolization Project, New Symbolization Publishing, and New Symbolization. The idea of a New Symbolization is that politically and religiously, today in the postmodern ideological scene, we don't have viable alternatives to what currently exists, and we don't have any good ways forward in terms of ways that people can work together to achieve a better world that don't fall into the same sort of culture war tropes and scripts that have sort of monopolized the social change scene. And so part of the goal with New Symbolization is like to get outside of the old ruts, scripts, and jargon, and to better familiarize ourselves with the fundamental questions, problems, concerns, interests, and mostly just concepts that we think would be necessary for a New Symbolization. And so part of my big realization was, I'm not Jesus, I'm not John the Baptist, I'm not, you know, some prophetic figure, or like, I'm not a Karl Marx even. I'm not someone who's going to come along and say, all right, everybody, I figured it all out. I read everything and here's all the solutions. I see my role more as an educator. And I think the first thing is just to say, look, if you haven't really read a great text until you've read it 3 times, and we can talk about like the kind of functions of those 3 readings, like what that actually entails. But if it's true that you haven't really read something until you've read something 3 times, then none of us have really read almost anything. And obviously not everything bears repeating, but great texts do. And there's this rush to change the world, like Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. There's this rush to change, even in theory circles, to where it's like, but we don't ever really get acquainted with the contradictions and actually work through those, much less, what we don't really tarry with the negative, right? And so what I want to do with Theory Underground is to create a space where it's not about having the right takes or the correct strategy or this is going to be the worldview that will change everything, but instead laying the groundwork and developing courses and materials and educational content that will help people in the future be able to hopefully do what we weren't able to do. And so we're looking to a future generation and trying to equip them by equipping ourselves to even be able to speak to them. As far as it being underground, it's not happening inside of the university, as it's not institutionally supported by anything mainstream, and that the mainstream academic monopolization of everything theory through the universities is part of the problem, because we think that if that enlightenment ideal of people taking responsibility for their own immaturity and developing themselves to think, how do I think about things? How do I decide what's real? How do I think about reality? If people don't take, in order to follow through on that vision, we can't just be influencers who come along and say, we've got it all figured out. We actually need a bigger push in the theory world that breaks outside of academia and says, look, everybody, insofar as you want to be thinking about the future and social change, you have to be taking on that responsibility yourself, not turning to influencers.
And do you want to add anything to that?
Obviously the Theory Underground is really Dave's undertaking, but I think like me being someone who's not fully immersed in the philosophy as much, I still see the importance of it as just being somewhere for people who like really want to get rigorous into texts and work, just a place for anyone of any background, class standing to come to. And so I just see it as really important, especially, along with like what you're doing, just having these spaces that are outside of the university that are a lot more affordable and that actually care about pursuing truth and knowledge, not just for a grade or because it's going to get us a degree, but because it matters to us. And so I think it's super awesome what both of you are doing. And I'm excited to get to kind of be here along for the ride and participate in the ways that I can. So, yeah.
Fantastic. There's so much there to respond to, but like just off the bat there, what you were saying, and when I was at university, I mean, it always blew my mind when I met students whose motivation seemed to be coming for the degree or the grade. And sort of like, I remember my first thought when I was entering community college, because I actually failed high school, was like, I'm kind of internally motivated. I'm just interested in the truth. I don't really care about the grade or the degree or anything like that. And I think that just carries through kind of into what I'm doing today. And I think what you guys are doing today. And that's kind of why I resonate with sort of let's say the ethos of Theory Underground. It's kind of, I always say I was operating under the presupposition that, kind of a naive presupposition in university, that the higher I go up the ladder, the closer I would be getting to truth. And then sort of the inverse was the case, that I just got closer and closer to sort of bureaucratic discussions and further away from, let's say, deep discussions or something like that. And that might be connected a little bit to an idea I wanted to touch on with both of you, which is this idea about education under the neoliberal university. And I know that's something you guys both care about a lot, in a sort of through a critical lens. And of course, that's sort of deep in critical theory today. But it might not be widespread knowledge. I remember when I was in grad school in a sort of a biological anthropology department, and all of the social theory people would always be talking about neoliberalization, but I actually had no idea what that meant at the time. So for the larger audience who might not know what exactly that means, can you talk a little bit about what it means to say, for example, that the university has been underneath a sort of political regime of neoliberalization, and what that might mean for learning outcomes and experience in university life?
And you should totally take it here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because that was the Boise State University had this great program called the Intermountain Social Research Lab, and basically the head of the sociology department was really interested in this idea of the neoliberalization of the university, and so I got to do some research with them for 2 years. And I think when we talk about the neoliberalization of the university, we talk about basically making what used to be like a public good, a public service, into a business model. And so the university is going to be working now, rather than for the benefit of students, they're going to be working to try to make the most profit for themselves. There's going to be a lot of corporate involvement, helping develop classes, having presence, like advertising around the campus. And so it really is like, in trying to explain this to like 18-year-old students who were forced to be there, it was, we're turning college and school into a business model. And so outcomes, kind of what that looks like, is learning becomes a means to an end rather than the end in itself. So you have a lot more kind of standardized testing, standardized work. Students aren't reading as much. Professors, because there's so much more bureaucracy and bureaucratic paperwork that they might have to go through, they're going to have less opportunity to have like real one-on-one time with students and have the time and energy and resources to be available to students. Along with that, treating the school as a business model, and with the main goal being profit, you're going to see a lot more focus on the aspects of the university that bring in profit, mainly sports, like the recreational complex. I mean, one university in the United States, I can't remember the name, like built a lazy river in their campus with student funds, coming from that extra however much you have to pay as a student. And so it really is just kind of degrading the actual academic quality of the university, and really just trying to pump out students who have a lot of debt into like corporate culture. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind for me as a Boise State alumni is that the library is called the Albertsons Library. The arena, while I was there, was called the Taco Bell Arena. The engineering building, I think it's like called the Micron building. Micron is it's a software company, Simplot has a bunch of buildings across campus. Simplot makes all of the potatoes that you eat as French fries at McDonald's. So when you see Simplot, you should think McDonald's, because that's their number one customer. And so which is kind of neat, by the way, because as an Idaho boy, I can go anywhere in the world and eat some Idaho potatoes. That's pretty cool. But I mean, come on. What is Simplot and Micron's interest in the university? And on the one hand, it's all about these parents who send their kids off for their first big step into the world, and the parents want their kids to succeed. And then they come and they visit for a football game, usually. And the students get together with their parents, and they go to a football game, and there's all this branding everywhere. And so the companies have a vested interest in associating this time of your life with these corporate brands. And no one can blame them for that. That's just advertising. Who cares, right? Who cares? I don't care. But what matters about it is that the Micron and Simplot people in Idaho get their people on the Idaho Board of Education for the state. They get their people on the various boards at the university. And now it's not just about branding, it's about changing the curriculum and what's required in order to get the degree, changing all of the prereqs and the goals to make students coming out of this university ideal recruits for their companies as employees. And obviously most people coming out of the university aren't going to get jobs there. So why are we getting this fine-tuned education that puts us on that track? Right? Well, it's because they want to pull from the cream of the crop people who are most passionate and excited and whatever. And it makes sense from their side. That's not evil. It's not evil, but there is a sort of tragedy occurs when there are conflicts of interests that go unnoticed or not brought out into the daylight. This is one of the things I get from dialectics, is that contradiction needs to be worked through, not just, you don't just wave your hands and run the other way when there's a contradiction. You got to work through it. And so when we come to the conflicts of interests at the university, we have to think, what are the competing interests of the different organizations, groups, departments, disciplines, fields, funding? Their business is obviously one of the big ones Anne just brought up. Politics is another one. And today it's pretty much right wingers are going to be the only people who really talk about it, usually at the university level. At the high school level, there's obviously all this talk of right wingers who don't want certain books read in high schools or lower level elementary school. And so there's like book burnings or whatever in the last couple of years, and that's serious. But on the other side, on the university side, there is also a sort of suffocating culture of, you know, there are certain things that one says or is supposed to believe, and then certain things you're not supposed to question. And that obviously runs counter to the ideal of the university, which is supposed to be a place where all genuine truth seekers, regardless of what their different beliefs might be, are able to be in a rigorous discourse and dialogue to work through things and to try to bring all of their different contradictory viewpoints to some higher level, right? There's supposed to be a dialectic there, and that's lacking. And part of it's business, part of it's politics, and a big part of it is bureaucracy caring about litigation culture, which is to say, like, they don't want to get sued. And so these different forces are always at play in the university. And so the only way to come back from that is not to just critique, oh, this is business, oh, this is politics, oh, this is bureaucracy, but is to instead do a positive critique. That's our big thing, positive critique. What's a positive critique in this sense? It just means what Karl Jaspers is doing in the idea of the university is he's fleshing out the idea almost in a Platonic sense. What is the idea that gave birth to the institution? How does the institution fall short of the idea? And how can we judge the institution without a more fully fleshed out articulation and idea of the university itself?
Yeah, fantastic. And I can connect that to, I love this idea of positive critique. So like, I feel like when I was in university, and again, sort of had sort of my preconceptions about what was going on in the humanities, it was, of course, very, my preconception was that it was very critical and very deconstructive. And so I like this emphasis on positive critique, and I could connect that a little bit with the difference between the dialectics of Kant and the dialectics of Hegel, because one of the emphases that Hegel puts on in the science of logic is that Kant's dialectic ends in a negative, meaning we can never get at the truth in itself. We can never get at the thing in itself. So it kind of ends in a negative, like where you're just stuck in the contradictions of reason, or what Kant would call the antinomies of reason. Whereas for Hegel, he's working very hard to try to get at the objective concept or the objective idea, trying to derive it. Not really, I mean, I really see his goals and aims as in alignment with Plato's, just perhaps in a different historical era. But the emphasis there is that you don't just critique to critique, but you critique to affirm something potentially better. And I see that also in your work here with Theory Underground. So on the one hand, we do have the neoliberalization of the institutions, and as you guys are saying, that's putting profit ahead of everything in a way that can be just, you know, have ridiculous situations, right? Like, and you were describing a lot of those ridiculous situations, you know. On the other hand, there is this course, the idea of the university, which is exploring basically like the Platonic ideal of the university. And one of the things Jaspers says in the book is, irrespective of where funding is coming from. He does talk about funding a little bit at the beginning, where he's talking about, you could get it from, inheritance, you could get it from investors, you could get it from an outside group, a philanthropist. But the overall point is that the investment does not distort the community's search for truth. And I think from what I'm gathering here, from what you're saying, the neoliberalization of the university does distort that, and it puts profit ahead of truth. I know that there are some other people, like in the culture wars, who are claiming that there are also moralistic agendas being put in favor of truth. So could you talk about a little bit how you see this conflict between neoliberalization and the search for truth, and perhaps how this has impacted your experience at the university?
And you want to go first?
Sure. I was gonna have you go first. Because that's like a big question to think about. I mean, yeah, as far as like how I kind of saw this like difference with like the neoliberalization versus like my personal desire for truth in the university, there was definitely a clash. I came in like really optimistic, really excited to meet a lot of people who were like me, who just wanted to have discussions all the time and really like rigorously read theory and read like hard texts and really grow as a learner and a thinker. I mean, I think because there aren't a lot of students like that, the university structures their lessons and kind of like structures their courses around this ideal that, okay, the level has been lowered. We're not requiring like readings, you're reading maybe some articles here and there. Throughout my entire time in the sociology department, outside of the research that I did, I didn't read I was never assigned a single primary text from any like actual real important sociologist. I read a young adult novel in a 400 level theory of social change class rather than reading like actual theory. And so I think like it really, in my experience, really lowered the level of the content and the curriculum of the classes. And I think professors just expect that. They expect that, students are coming in knowing, okay, they're going to have a lot of debt. They just are here to get a job. Like the whole university culture just kind of promotes that, like, oh yeah, you come here, you have some fun, you get your degree, that makes you worthy of a professional job. And so this professors know this and they kind of structure their classes in that way. So it was definitely like lacking in real structure and content in a majority of my classes, which was really frustrating, being someone who was at the university to pursue truth and knowledge and grow as a thinker. And so that's kind of where I saw the divide, is especially like within the classroom. So Dave, I don't know what else, your experiences were.
I just want to say quick before Dave jumps in, it's just a crime that you were never assigned a primary text. That's one of the things that I want to emphasize in philosophy portals. Like, no, let's read the greatest works that have ever been written and let's talk about them. Sorry,
right. And even in the classes, like I took 2 philosophy classes just out of interest. And even in those ones, you're just getting like a tiny little blurb and it's not really structured. And they just like kind of assume that you're not going to get it. And so they go, okay, well, I tried, let's move on to this person now, and not like really giving us the time and respect to like, let's make your brains work. Let's think here and let's just focus on 1 or 2 things. It's kind of this fast pace, like, okay, we're onto this subject. Okay, we're onto this subject. Got to get you as much information so you can pass the test to get the credits, rather than just like slowing down. We're going to read 2 books this semester. All you have to do is write an essay about it. It was a lot of like, and I think Dave will be able to speak to this, but a lot of busy work.
Sounds like it's also, just before Dave jumps in as well, like it sounds like also like the digitization of the university, like the TikTokization of the university. It's like a, like it's almost like we're already in accelerationism kind of thing. Like, anyway, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, 100% though. I'll use a story that had a profound impact on me early into my academic career. I was a non-traditional student. When I started, I kind of was under the assumption, like you, that people come here because they're in a time in their life where they're going to give themselves over to the pursuit of truth primarily. And I also had, I also burnt out on trying to get a leg up in the world through working at entry-level jobs. You know, that was, I had also tried to apprentice for various trades. And really, I found myself just being like, no, I just need to spend some time just reading and getting to know myself and my place in the world. And before I make any more big decisions about where I'm going. So I went to the university, and I think I already told this story once, so I'll keep it short. The first grade I got back in my political and social philosophy course was an F, and it was on the weekly written, reflection. It's like, how do you fail a written reflection? But when I went to the professor's office hours, he told me that philosophy is not something that you can do on the side while focusing on math homework all the time. Like, no, he said, the same way that you sit there for 5 hours in the library working on your math problems, you actually have to do that with philosophy. You can't read it at the beach. You can't read it in a half hour. You can't go off of Sparks Notes. You can't do a Goodreads review or watch a YouTube video. You have to actually read through it and then try to make sense of it on your own, or you're not going to get anything out of it. And, you get out of it what you put into it. And so it was that sort of slap upside the face, like in the first, I mean literally, he slapped me upside the face. He was just like, psst. No, I'm just kidding. But no, if it wasn't for that figurative slap, then I wouldn't have gotten as serious as I did, as early as I did. And I fear that I would have fallen off. I would have probably burnt out. I would have found myself doing a lot of busy work. I would have been getting good grades in my math and science for a while, but my soul would have been suffering. And so I would have dropped out. I'm pretty sure of that. But instead, because I was forced to really take Plato's Republic seriously, and then all the other texts that followed from that, which were also primary because that professor respected primary works, I was profoundly impacted, and it changed my life forever. And it made me realize that there's more important things. And so the problem is, and this is something that the professor, Dr. Cates at North Idaho College, he always deals with, is people say that he goes too hard on you. There was actually a student strike against him before I actually went to North Idaho College. I met one of the people who had organized a strike against Dr. Cates, and that person was like, yeah, no, I used to hate his guts. It took a while for me to kind of understand where he's coming from, and now I respect him like crazy. So this person who had been in a factory, in a union, he was like in his 40s, he had actually led the student walkout, and they had written stuff to the administration and the faculty complaining about how harsh this professor's grading was. He had actually had a change of heart over the years by the time I met him. But the other administration and faculty at North Idaho College, they're always pulling up his courses for review. And if it wasn't for the fact that students keep coming to testify about how fundamental of an impact Dr. Cates had on them, they would have already stopped letting him keep these courses going. They would have discontinued these courses. And Dr. Cates told me that in actual faculty meetings, though, other professors had looked at him and said that he needed to lower the bar. And they were just, I don't know how mask off they were actually about this, but they said, you need to make it easier. You need to stop going so hard on them. And then when Dr. Cates was saying, well, like, they need a real challenge. Like, how are they going to be that they can't apply to UC Berkeley if I don't, make sure that at their associate level, they actually have a real challenge. And he said that the response is, yeah, but these kids just want jobs, and they're rural kids. We've got a lot of rural kids here. What does rural mean? Rural is academicese for white trash.
Yeah.
That's what they mean. They mean these kids are white trash. They just need better jobs. Stop giving them such a hard time. And he said, I used to teach inner city Black youth, and it was the same thing there. You need to lower the bar. These kids just need jobs. They're never going to get out of the ghetto if you don't lower the bar. And so he said he was facing the same thing with inner city youth as he was dealing with here at a rural community college. So this is what happens when we turn the idea of the university into nothing more than, oh, these are our customers, and our job is to help them get better jobs.
All right, there's a lot of ideas here going through my head. So like, it's very clear to me that, you know, the picture you guys are painting here, that the university is under some sort of you know, it's being subsumed or sublated under a business model, and basically, you know, what the university is, or what the university is becoming, is a lot different than, let's say, the Platonic ideal that Jaspers is trying to derive in his work. You know, and specifically, it's just this factory for producing people who might be candidates for hire in corporate America and stuff like this. Now Jaspers does, I don't want to get too far into the book so quick, but there is a point Jaspers makes in the book about how university education is, he says multiple times, university education is not high school education. It's not for everyone. And he even puts some sort of framing on it, like that universities for a very specific type of person. And I feel like we have, you know, in sort of generalizing, automating, universalizing even the idea of the university, you know, like where the idea was at one point, okay, we're all going to go to high school. Now the idea is we're all going to go to college, or we're all going to go to university, you know, that, you know, you bring up this idea perhaps that there's a watering down of the standard that goes on, and the consequence of that. And that's a difficult idea for me to reconcile with, in the sense that, you know, in my ideal, you know, you have this idea that, well, everyone should have a chance to go to university, and everyone should have a chance to pursue truth on that level. But Jaspers brings up the point that maybe not, maybe it's more selective. Maybe there's only a certain type of person who is not, it's not about necessarily like, you know, a one type of intelligence thing or anything like that, but there's a certain type of person that is going to be inclined towards the type of truth search that the university should hold. And, you know, so for example, in building something like Philosophy Portal, I definitely see in the first few courses I've done, not everyone has this sort of inclination. Now, it's very interesting to encounter and be around the type of people who do, and to try to build that and try to foster that and try to go really deep as you can go. And I meet a lot of people like that. But it's certainly not everyone. And so what emotions or what feelings do you have that come up when I bring up this topic? And, you know, as educators or as people sort of trying to develop courses in this direction, you know, how should we think about this problem? I know it's a very, you know, this is the difficult question.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the type of question we would go to in the course, but yeah, and go ahead.
Yeah. You know, that is tough, because obviously we want like higher education and opportunities to, yeah, like have a degree, to have higher paying jobs. Like we want the opportunity for everyone, but in terms of like what the idea of the university is supposed to be, that really, I think it's such an independent journey, that like just to have an institution that is open to anyone at any point in their life, whether they've just come out of high school and are ready to keep building, or they need to have 1, 2, 3, 10 years of time just to go drink and party and travel, and then they're ready to, you know, I don't want to say get serious, but to like stop maybe the partying and like really focus on that pursuit of truth for a while. And so I think there just needs to be that space, and ideally it would be the university, but having something like the Theory Underground or the Philosophy Portal is just places where people who want to really challenge their minds and grow because it matters to them as a human. And I think just reconciling with that, not everyone is gonna have that interest. Some people are going to like get really, really into their music or pursuing other passions really seriously. And some people are just going to be happy going to the bar every weekend and having a family and like living, you know, a life like that, where they're not super into theory, which is super valid. And I think with where the university stands right now, we just think that, oh, you have to come here and get a good job. And if you don't deserve a home security, like you're less than. And so just reconciling with this doesn't make us like morally superior by any means, trying to, read hard philosophy and theory, but it's just an option if you want that in your life, is kind of my response to such a deep question.
Yeah, and these are the types of questions I imagine that like we're going to try and bring out in the course, right? Like, and go deeper on these types of things. I mean, before I get your response, Dave, it's like, after sort of going deeper onto the idea of the university by Jaspers, it's like, and the way, and contrasting that with how you guys are describing specifically the American system, it's like we've, and to phrase it kind of in a Hegelian way, it's like we've lost the idea completely. Like it's like there is no idea anymore. It's just, I get, and it maybe it's not a coincidence that I feel like the last few decades and the decades in which I was developing as an intellect were at the same time kind of the decades of the degradation and the loss of philosophy in some sense. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that we've kind of lost the idea or the concept of the university. It's kind of like, oh, now it's gone. Like we really took it for granted. And maybe these little underground initiatives are really where the idea needs to grow. So Dave, if you have any comments on that, go for it.
Yeah, I would just, I want to caution against anyone who's watching us talk about this from maybe taking away or deducing from what we've said so far, the idea that it's therefore worthless or that the idea is completely dead. The idea could not be completely dead. If the idea was completely dead, there would be no more great professors in the university. But there are great professors in the university, therefore the idea is alive. There are still great students in the university, therefore the idea is still alive, but it's suffering. And the idea is suffering because we live in a scientific, technological, instrumentalized age. Ideas are not easily instrumentalized. They're usually things that are good in themselves. The idea of instrumentalization is that the only things that get any attention are going to be the things that are good towards some other means, or that are a means towards some other end, whether that's profit, political power, whatever. So with your question, I would say it's not that the idea is dead, but that a lot of people who go to it for that reason drop out, or once they've graduated, they decide that they couldn't do another 15 years of that just to get tenure, right? And so it is creating underground theorists everywhere. Everywhere you have a dropout who still wants to pursue truth, you have a budding underground theorist. And obviously you might just be an underground scientist who's toying around with gadgets and AI in your garage or whatever, but what makes you a theorist is that you're trying to understand, right? And so if you're trying to understand why you dropped out, if you're trying to understand why the idea was so hard to find instantiations of at the university, then yeah, I think that you're a budding underground theorist. And I was going to make a comparison though, to say that the institution of marriage is falling apart, but the idea of marriage and of love is not dead. People are still moved by the idea, but because we live in this instrumentalized age, no one talks about the idea. They just talk about the institution. Oh, the institution's in crisis. Oh, the institution needs to be salvaged. Oh, these are the things that go against the institution. Oh, these are the things that, oh, look at how high the divorce rate is. Look, people, as soon as it gets uncomfortable or inconvenient, then they just end the relationship. Okay, that's not a positive critique. A positive critique would have recourse to the idea. And so it's the job of philosophers to say, we're not just a department that is equal to construction management. We're not just a department that is equal to whatever you were doing in biology. No, we have an intimate relation to all of these other fields, but it is our job to say how they fit together. And it's our job to say what ideas these fields or disciplines ultimately serve, because we're the ones whose task it is to think what ideas even are, where do they come from, and if we are in this complete bio constructivist, reductivist, instrumentalized era, and philosophers decide, oh yeah, we'll just act like we're a construction management department just like anyone else, and we'll just kind of work in our little corner, work on niche little problems. And if we're not thinking about the whole, then it's our fault. It's not the fault of the person who wants to do construction management. It's not the fault of the administration or the faculty who are involved in any other corner of the university. It always comes back to philosophy, because philosophy is the origin of ideas in this rigorous sense. And so we're the ones who have to do something, and the thing is you can be in the university or outside of the university and still keep the idea alive in your classroom or in your daily walk of life, in your practice.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, nothing gets me more excited than someone getting super passionate about philosophy there. He's getting so passionate he had to take a drink. I like that. Yeah, he's like, he just ran the 100-meter dash there.
I'm going to go do some push-ups now, yeah.
You know, it reminds me, something of what you were saying reminds me of something J.K. Chesterton said about Plato, where he said, sometimes Plato would talk about ideas as if people didn't exist. And the way you were talking about ideas was the opposite, where, you know, if as long as there are people there, the idea still exists. And I like that emphasis, and at the same time, you know, from that point of view, we do have a situation where people do not talk about ideas anymore. And your example with the institution of marriage and the idea of marriage is a perfect example. And the thing is that if people don't talk about the idea of marriage, or if, for example, if people don't talk about the idea of the university, then guess what? When things get difficult, it's going to fall apart. So you need to have an idea, because if you don't have an idea, yeah, precisely, well, what happens is you'll go to pleasure. You know, it's the idea that will help you go above pleasure and will inspire you to that higher standard. And precisely to be inspired, we need to have people that embody that idea, or else it's just an abstract idea, it's disembodied. So, you know, all of these things are really complex, but at the same time, it really hits home, you know, how important it is that this work you guys are doing is being done. And it's kind of also inspiring when you say something like, every time there is, you know, when the university doesn't have an idea and there are all these truth seekers that are going to drop out because the university doesn't have the idea there, well, it's not going to kill the idea. It's just going to create a network of underground theorists. And that's sort of an also inspiring notion. And it's kind of like that, you know, I was talking with Mikey a little bit about it's like kind of hip hop. It's kind of punk rock, you know, it's underground, you know, and it has that sort of energy to it, which I think is, you know, at the same time as it's, you know, not a good. Yeah. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, sorry, I didn't, I want you to finish your thought. Okay. And I'm glad you brought up the punk rock, hip hop, underground thing, because especially with the Young Jijikian crew, which is just one clique within a broader underground, right? Every underground any scene requires groups of friends, you know? And that's one of the things that Karl Jaspers talks about, is that the idea of the university and any sort of like truth deriving or emerging field or discipline, it doesn't come from the university itself. It always comes from some smaller nucleus that is usually in relation to the university. Either they're employed there or they're in dialogue with people at the university. So any healthy scene requires diversity in groups and maybe even some friendly competition between those groups. It should never get toxic, right? But the point is, and the reason I brought up the Young Jijikians is like, Andrew and Nick, but also Mikey, they all bring rap and hip hop into it because that's kind of their roots. Whereas I bring post-hardcore, post-punk, pop punk, deathcore, metal, all of this heavy stuff, because that's my teenage years, that's my early 20s. And Andrew's cool because Master Signified Bodies, he's actually like, he comes from both worlds. So he's kind of the bridge there between those two worlds. And so we make a lot of memes about this, but the main point is just to draw that comparison, because once you stop thinking about it as, oh, it's me and my group of truth seekers versus the world, and you realize, oh, it's a scene, and we're like a band in that scene. And a scene takes all types. It takes really high level, experimental, avant-garde, super skilled bands, and they usually don't pull as big of crowds. And then it also takes people that know 3 chords, but they're charismatic, and they bring the big crowds. And like getting the booking agencies and the venues and the different bands to have, even though they're going to be competitive at the end of the day with some of their interests, to get them to have working cooperative relationships and to foster a healthier discourse is really important. And so drawing these connections between underground music and underground theory just felt important. But then there's also the underground in London. The London Underground is the subway system there. The logo to Theory Underground is actually ripped off directly from the London Underground. Did you recognize it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I lived in London for a bit.
Yeah. So, a lot of Americans won't get it until they go to London, but right. It's basically the same logo. It's been made our own, but the point there,
mind the gap.
Yes. Theory Underground is a triple entendre. Theory, please.
Okay, yeah. You're competing with Jay-Z now.
Yes. Who's that?
Said you're competing with Jay-Z. Yeah. Triple entendre.
Yeah. Triple entendre. Well, on the one hand, Theory Plea went underground. Is owning that position and then trying to theorize what that means. So that's the first one. Second one was this music underground analogy, and then the third one is the analogy to the London Underground, and that's why I say all aboard, and then I push this button. Can you hear that?
No,
you can't hear.
I didn't hear anything.
Okay. For some reason it's not playing over Zoom, but it does play over Stream. But I have a button that has train whistles. Anyway, the point is like all aboard, train whistles. What's the train in the analogy? It's a line of thought. So thinking about the idea of the university, that is a line of thought that connects to another line of thought called critical pedagogy, which connects to another line of thought. And there's all these different lines of thought, but they're not going to be productive lines of thought if you're not reading, writing, and having rigorous conversations with other people who did similar readings and similar writing. So even if we're outside of the university, even if we're not grading our assignments, even if we're not doing a lot of the busy work that we would have done in the university, we actually have to raise the stakes and raise the difficulty level on ourselves to try to get that thing that we weren't getting when we were there. And so when I say like there's a line of thought departing, all aboard, with the idea of the university, the point is, look, you can have conversations about the problems at the university or what the ideal properly should be. You can have those conversations with anybody, but a lot of times that's just going to be talking, and you're going to fall right back into scripts. If you're not talking with people who have done primary textual readings on the topic, and if you're not talking to people who have spent a lot of time after writing, then thinking through these things and writing about it for themselves, right? Without that basis in the textual life and the writing as thinking, without that basis, it's just talking. It's not a real dialectical conversation. And so I like this idea of like a train is departing, get on. It's not like it's never going to come back. It's not like it's never going to depart again, but it is a prerequisite for going deeper on this topic with other people. And so we want to make spaces with the forum where it's like, you can say stuff here and you can presuppose that anybody in this forum community already did the reading and already has some of these same questions in mind. And so, and someone who's reading Being in Time with me in the summer, because I'll be teaching Being in Time in the summer, might not have done the idea of the university, might not have done the PMC, might not have done Zizek's For They Know Not What They Do, which are other courses that are coming out of Theory Underground. And that's fine. But there's going to be different forums dedicated to these different lines of thought. And then if it's 5 years from now that you finally get around to saying, okay, I'm at a point in my life where now I want to interrogate the idea of the university, the train's still there. Go to the site. The course is still available after the fact. The forum is still alive. The people who were involved, some of them are still involved in the forum. And so even though you're taking it after the fact, hopefully you'll be plugged into the conversation anyway. So that's the train metaphor I wanted to talk about.
Great. Yeah, it's yeah, good that you went a little bit more into that. And yeah, this band scene metaphor I also find quite helpful. I mean, because it forces you to think about what's going on here as an ecology. And now in terms of thinking about it as an ecology, as opposed to say like an individualistic or just a group thing, well, by necessity, an ecology has a diversity of groups and there's conflict and competition. I mean, every ecology is competitive and actually in the natural world quite violent, and that raises some I think, for my mind and sort of my experience in this ecology, because I still think it's still quite new and I still think it's quite perhaps red and tooth and claw type of thing, is that it's hard to know the boundaries, and it's hard to know what ethical conflict is, and it's hard to know where cooperation starts and ends, and it's hard to know who's operating on what presupposition and what, who's looking for good faith dialogue, who's not looking for good faith dialogue, and all of these things. And then there's all sorts of political, economic, things where you are, like, at least for me, and I think for you as well, like, you are sort of building a small business. And in that sense, we're not anti-business, but the point is that the profit isn't the primary motive. The truth is the primary motive, and keeping it that way, and so forth like that. But my question here is about, how do you read the ecology? How do you think about the ecology? And, what have been some of the problems? Maybe don't need to get into like specific problems, but like, well, let's talk about this right now. Like, I mean, I'm hosting you, I'm building Philosophy Portal, you're building Theory Underground, but, I see like there's potential for synergies and stuff like that. So how do we, I suppose, navigate the early ecological days of this type of underground theory type of work? Or do you have any ideas about that? I mean, there's difficult ethical problems, I think, that come up.
The ethical problems for me mostly come down to wanting to create a space where free thought and truth seeking are the sort of primary thing. Although I say over truth seeking, I would say what frames it better is understanding through concepts, which is part of truth seeking. But I just think that saying understanding through concepts and interpretation, that's important. You want to have a variety of viewpoints, but not just viewpoints with opinions, but actually basis in texts. And but the problem with that is we live in a highly politicized culture war moment, and a lot of people attracted to the idea of free thinking and free thought are on the right, and their idea is all of the problems with education comes from the overrepresentation of liberals in the educational scene and in Hollywood, et cetera, and therefore pretty much everything that's not okay in liberal spaces should be okay in a genuine truth-seeking space. And I'm sympathetic to the perspective, but I have to draw lines somewhere. And that's one of the difficult things that's a place that I've been put in. After a decade of philosophical dialogue with different people, and I have conversations with I wouldn't say Nazis, but I've had genuine philosophical dialogue with various stripes of right winger that included a person who was like openly like white nationalist. And no, it's not like we were doing podcasts or anything like that. We weren't doing podcasts together. But I met him in real life, and I didn't know what his political beliefs were at first. And then there just became a point where I was like, well, this is a real crisis. Anna and I were on a hike actually, and we were talking about it. It's like I want to live in a world where politically you can say what you want, you could do what you want, as long as you're leaving other people alone. There's a lot of wiggle room for people to be able to work through ideas. And so then I try to treat individuals that way in my personal life. Okay, but political and personal, though there's a lot of overlap, it's not always the same thing, because at the end of the day, just because I want someone to be able to exist and not be put in prison or some extermination camp for having different beliefs than me, doesn't mean I have to associate with them.
So we're not
Right?
dealing with any theory underground gulags here, you know what I'm saying?
Not yet. not, not yet.
Right.
But,
No,
I mean,
yeah. No,
and
it's
hopefully
interesting.
never.
On this point, I just want to make a quick point that I was just reading about what happened when Hegel died to his to the German idealist school. And what's interesting is that as soon as Hegel died, the school fractured between left, right, and center Hegelians. Right. And so it's so interesting how politics is obviously so polarizing and create so many issues about boundaries and precisely where do you draw the line, and it's precise, like, and I think it's worth, I'll throw it back to you, but just thinking about this question is when you have a white nationalist, say you have a black nationalist or something like that, like whatever the controversial idea is, how do you contain that space for difficult dialogues? Because I think if you push it underground, then it's going to potentially become cancerous.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I'll throw it back to you, but the question that I run through my mind is how do we build the containment space where difficult dialogues can happen? Actually, Slavoj Žižek brought this up in Surplus Enjoyment, that the university shouldn't be a safe space. The world is not a safe space, and the university should be a place where you can have difficult conversations, basically, and it's a containment problem about difficult conversations.
It is, and it's one of the actually, I want Anne to be able to address this, because she just finished that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, by Jonathan Haidt and someone else. And I'm wondering if I share my screen. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. I was going to show.
I can open that. You can share your screen now, I think.
Okay, I have a bunch of memes here that are Jasper memes. Can everybody see this meme here?
I got you. Yeah, I think we can all see it.
Yep.
Okay, so there's 4 memes that are various stereotypical Wojaks from the meme scene, saying something people say about universities, and then Jaspers with the boss sunglasses kind of coming back at them with an actual quote from the book. And the one that I want to highlight is the stereotypical SJW, social justice warrior, Wojak, crying with the thick rimmed glasses and the red hair, and it says beside that, Brown University student in 2015 at the on-campus safe space with cookies, coloring books, bubbles, and Play-Doh. Quote, I was feeling bombarded by a lot of viewpoints that really go against my dearly and closely held beliefs. This is a real quote from a real situation, and I wouldn't have known about it if Anne hadn't have told me. But before I hand it over to her, I'm going to read the Jaspers comeback. He says, to be permeated by the idea of a university is part of a way of life. It is the will to search and seek without limitation, to allow reason to develop unrestrictedly, to have an open mind, to leave nothing unquestioned, to maintain truth unconditionally. The university keeps itself distinct from sects, churches, and fanatical groups which seek to impose their own outlook upon others. The university does this because it wants to thrive in freedom only and would perish rather than carefully shelter itself from unfamiliar ideas and withdraw from intellectual conflict where fundamentals are involved. And before handing it over, though, I'll just say that this problem goes back to the origin of the university. Socrates was put to death for, at a certain point, challenging the fundamental presuppositions and values of Athenian society. And one might say, oh, well, that's terrible. They shouldn't have done that to him. He didn't say that. Socrates never said they shouldn't have laws. Socrates never said they shouldn't put me to death. He instead said, when they all said, look, man, we can get you out of prison. We can get you out of the city state here. We can get you somewhere to safety. He said, nah, I'm going to make them all sit with what they've decided here. And so the tragedy is not that professors sometimes get laid off. It's not even that the culture of the institution is permeated with a sort of fear of self-censorship and silencing, or because of a fear of repercussions. People can only make a stand and do the courageous thing and pursue truth in that context. And that context has never not been with us. Right. And so it's not a unique or a new problem, though it's reached a new level of intensity and more people are worrying about the problem because more people are expected to go to college. So this used to be a problem for elite or, children of aristocrats. Now it's a problem for basically anybody who's not working manual labor, who's got to go for some kind of a specialized degree. And so there's a lot more rage about it because there's a lot more people having to deal with it. But it's not it's not a unique or new. And that's my main thing, is to say, and it's not, I have a lot more thoughts, but I want to hand it over to Anne, and I'm going to turn my camera off and I'll be right back.
I just want to say quickly that like this, the emphasis with Jaspers are saying that, to be permeated by the idea of the university, and, the university keeps itself distinct from sects, churches, and fanatical groups. It's kind of as though, I've always seen the woke movement as kind of this weird, unconscious immersion of a type of religious type of thought, which appears secular, but it actually is enacted in a religious type of way, in a strange way. It's a weird. I think that's where we need to think about the unconscious as well. But Anne, go ahead.
Yeah. So last month I finished the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and basically the authors kind of highlight what they see the problem is right now in the university. And so they talk about 3 kind of untruths that are believed by a lot of incoming college students and therefore the college campus, which is the idea that the culture is like us, it's an us versus them world. The idea that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, not stronger. And then the idea that that you should always trust your feelings. And so they talk about the ways in which that manifests within the classroom, specifically as reactions to ideas that might be challenging, uncomfortable, go against our own beliefs, gender identities, like whatever you might want to say, or whatever it might be. But so that example in the meme was just one of like the many, many examples where students felt like physically unsafe because of a controversial idea or because of something that maybe was a little bit more conservative to them. Like, I'm sure maybe you've heard of like when Milo Yiannopoulos was touring the country, there were mass riots on college campuses and people were getting their heads bashed in by like protesters who were, supposedly on the right side of history. And so, they kind of like highlight that culture and then talk about where in society they think that kind of comes from. And a lot of their focus was on like safetyism, a culture of safetyism, a culture of where like children kind of have less independence and there's overprotection of children. They have less free play, kind of less opportunities to go out into the real world, as well as just like the overall political divide that's in America. They were specifically talking about American universities. But so I think, like part of the issue of this like reaction to hard, challenging, even like offensive ideas, like talking about white supremacy and considering all of the nuances of race and gender and identity and all of that. I think like they make a good argument as to kind of where that comes from. But I think, the challenge is not being so like ideological about it and taking a step back and kind of remembering what those untruths are and going, no, like human beings are fundamentally not fragile people. We are meant to be challenged. We are meant to be resilient. And and to be able to like think about those hard things and overcome it. And that is kind of the idea of the university should be a space to talk about things that, yeah, might offend us, that we might not personally agree with, and to get to the bottom of it and to be able to argue why it's wrong, rather than saying, oh, it's wrong because it hurts my feelings and I need to play with Play-Doh now to feel better. Like, no, you should challenge yourself to feel better by like using reason and logic to go, no, this isn't right because X, Y, and Z that I read. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of place that we're in culturally, as far as like with the woke culture, like social justice advocates who obviously want something good, but maybe the way that they're trying to achieve it right now is clashing with what the idea of the university should be. And so it's a challenge for sure.
And
Yes, Dave.
then I just want to be really quick, just to tie all of that.
No, go for it.
Because I wanted to really drive home. The reason we bring up all of that is not because we want to get on board with this, oh, there's no free speech and there's no real critical thinking in the universe. No, the point is to say that the role I have and the role that you have is complicated, because if that dialogue can't happen in the university, are we the ones who are supposed to host it? And the thing is I have to make decisions at the end of the day as an individual, because I'm not an institution. If I was an institution, I could easily, in a sort of sense, more easily facilitate that kind of diversity. And it's like, at the end of the day, I have my own limits on what I'm comfortable with associating with. And so, Chad Haig is one of the people who's been around for a long time doing philosophy stuff on YouTube. And I appreciate a lot of the stuff that he puts out, and he feels called to put stuff out that deals with dangerous, forbidden texts. And fair enough. And I could have and I've learned from the stuff that he puts out. And I think that there's probably a lot of great people in his community. But I have to make decisions about like what I do. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to do anything related to the Unabomber, because I'm not trying to attract an audience of people who are at that point. That's not my calling. And I have to make that decision. But I think that a university should. I think that there ought to be a class within the university scene for dealing with texts like that. Where is Spangler?
I read a text by the Unabomber when I was at McMaster University History Department. I mean, it's and I appreciated that it was on offer. I could read the manifesto. I mean, I think even I took a Nazi Germany class where we read Mein Kampf, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, exactly. That to me is the university.
Exactly. But then it comes back to, okay, but what are my goals, and how are my goals or my levels of comfort dealing with certain topics? How does that become an ethical quandary? Because I'm not an institution. I am, at the end of the day, a person, and so that's something that I've just got to work through.
We are in some sense, because it's so early days, there is a great deal of vulnerability in putting yourself out there. And there is this question of, like, there is an infinite number of things you could teach, but the question is what you put forward is also establishing a certain image and ideal, right? Like to start I'll talk about me first, but you doing a course on the idea of the university says something. There's millions of books. I mean, you pick one specific book and it says something about what Theory Underground stands for and represents. Just like if you teach about the Unabomber, it says something about what you stand for and represent in some sense. Like you pick that. You could have picked many texts, right? So like for me with Philosophy Portal, I started with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. That's a cornerstone. That's a foundation stone for what I want Philosophy Portal to build out and represent, right? I'm teaching something there, actually, what the Phenomenology of Spirit represents as a text, because you come into the Phenomenology of Spirit course, we can talk about anything, but we're studying the Phenomenology of Spirit. And that's the discourse which you're limited by if you come into this space, just like if you come into the Science of Logic space, or you come into the Thus Spoke Zarathustra space, we can talk about anything. I mean, Nietzsche is a very controversial figure. I mean, You want to talk about Nietzsche? We can talk about all the controversial stuff about Nietzsche, all you like. You're going to teach on Heidegger and being in time? Well, lots of controversial things we talk about Heidegger's political life, right? Like, I mean, there's no limit to it. And you could host those discussions, right, within that container of being in time. But like what phenomenology of spirit stands for and represents is that that text is supposed to teach you about the coming to be of a philosopher. So that's what Philosophy Portal stands for. Philosophy Portal stands for the coming to be the philosopher. So when you teach, for example, the idea of the university, I take that to be a similar type of gesture. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I love that. This is so early for me, and I'm still having trouble articulating things like my role. And I think that you just really nailed it. And you didn't say the word branding, but it comes down to branding, because these are platforms in the attention economy. People won't remember who you are if you don't have a brand. You can't even if you have a name, you have a brand, because that is the context that our name is presented in. So even though we don't want it to be like profit driven, we still have to exist in this context, and even to be remembered is to be a brand. And so for me, I've been anti-brand, anti-influencer now for like 3 years. I went from kind of trying to do it to then becoming so critical of my own self and my attempt. And now I'm coming out of that again and just kind of going, okay, it's a brand. I'm just not going to take it so seriously. And I'm not an influencer. My job is an educator. That's the change there. What is a brand at the very sort of outside of the context of business, when we're just talking about attention and we're talking about signifiers, we're talking about the sense that a signifier takes on, what gives it the connotation and the denotation that the signifier takes on? It's the things that it's brought into association with. Semiotics, basic semiotics, is that there's not just words self-standing in themselves on their own, atomized. Words are only made sense of, and they only get their sense through association to other ones. And the same thing goes with all signifiers, not just words. But my face, the name Theory Underground, what are people going to associate that with? Okay, and then the books that we read, the primary books that's going to be the you're right. That's probably the most important part right there. We can talk about anything, but that's the most important thing.
See, I feel like instead of getting into flame wars online about arguing with people, all of that's nonsense. Not getting into flame wars and arguments like stuff like that. To me, it's about the concrete idea, and the text we put out and the stuff we put out is the concrete idea. It speaks for itself. That's what we're standing for. That's the direction you're going with. That's the train, so to speak. You want to get on the train, you can get on the train. You want to get off the train, you can get off the train. This is the train. And so, I think that you do have to make these fundamental decisions, which at the end of the day come down to value judgments, which you're making as a singular, as an educator, as an instructor, right? Like, I mean, Karl Jaspers in The Idea of the University talks about how, the most mature, the most experienced, the most intelligent professors, when they teach courses that summarize a body of work, that's one of the most valuable functions in the university. And at the end of the day, that comes down to the value judgments of that professor, and that professor, through their wisdom, through their experiences, communicating that and wants to share that and create that culture in the world. And it is more than them. It's a part of a subculture which is being built, and it stands for something, right? Like, so for example, again, I'll speak like, for example, with the direction of Philosophy Portal is that, what does it stand for? It stands for bringing topics of phenomenology, bringing topics of existentialism, bringing topics of logic, deep logic into the forefront, and standing for that and trying to build a deeper discourse in that. But I feel like for a second, we should go back a little bit to what Anne brought up as it relates to the coddling of the American mind. So she brought up 3 aspects of the coddling of the American mind: is an us versus them mentality, what might kill you makes you weaker instead of stronger, and to trust your feelings. And I want to know, and I also, there's actually something else after that she said that I thought was really, really salient, which is that students felt physically unsafe because of talking about controversial ideas. And I think, at least what I like when I'm trying to foreground things like phenomenology, existentialism, and logic, I feel like we have to create a culture where talking about controversial ideas does not have an effect on an effective level of your physical safety. And to me, what that signifies is that you haven't actually been in a culture which builds up the idea, like that talks about the idea. Because if you build up and talk about the idea, then you're so robust that talking about controversial ideas doesn't make you feel physically unsafe. What it means is that if people are feeling physically unsafe, it's because they have no idea. Like that they actually have physical affects as a consequence of that. So I think that's also a very interesting theoretical, interesting thing to think, is that if you don't have a culture which builds up the idea, your body is not going to be able to withstand the culture war.
Yeah, for sure. That's
one thing I want to, that I was also thinking when you were talking about that, and that it goes right along with that, is I'd say the thread that they leave out. And can you verify that they leave this out? Do they ever talk about litigation culture?
I think a little bit. It's definitely not like a section of the book, I don't think, as far as like why they see it, but I think like it definitely is covered a bit.
Cool. So what I was going to say is that the left since the 60s has learned that social change is made by making bureaucrats uncomfortable and scared of lawsuits. So then bureaucrats affect change because they're scared. And so obviously you can only cry wolf for so long though. The issue is that on the one side, people don't have the idea. And so then they just feel things and they vibe, but then they are encouraged and incentivized just to vibe, because the only theory of social change they have is that it comes from administrators being scared of lawsuits. So it's no longer about, is it dangerous? It's just, is it plausible to the administrators that these students actually feel threatened? If it's plausible to the administrators that these students actually feel threatened, then these administrators have to do something because of litigation culture. And so students are actually being incentivized to become more unreasonable and more in touch with how they feel about something and then exaggerating it. And obviously, I'm not saying everybody who's having strong feelings is exaggerating. And the thing is you can feel very strong feelings and still do reasonable dialogue and still keep researching. So I'm not saying those things are mutually exclusive, but yeah, the incentive is there to not think and to instead just feel bigly.
Right. Yeah. And it's actually, so one of my favorite parts, or one of my favorite aspects of the phenomenology of spirit is actually in the preface. And for anyone who hasn't read the preface of that book, definitely give it some time, read the preface. But
the preface is my favorite book. I can probably just say
the preface of that book, it's so good. Yeah. So yeah, it's a masterpiece. And one of the aspects of the preface that I like is when he emphasizes this distinction, and I always highlight this in the course, is that this relationship between intuitive immediacy and the results of the concept. And I feel like what's happened with sort of like the idea falling out of our culture and dialectical logic not being taught and thought and not building up the idea in our head is that what we're left with is just immediate intuition. So feeling bigly, right? Like whatever you're, so you have an immediate intuition that something's bad. You have an immediate intuition that something's wrong, but you actually don't have the concept for it. You just feel bigly. And so this feeling bigly just throws itself around. And so what's at stake, I think, in education, and this is actually, I'll connect this to the science of logic, because Hegel goes on at length in the preface of the Science of Logic to say that actually the point of logic is not abstract disembodied formalism. The point of logic is actually to constrain and process the instincts. And so actually, if you have a culture which isn't trained in logic, you have a culture which is not capable of, let's say in psychoanalytic terms, sublimating the instinct and actually getting to the point of a drive. So for example, you might have a culture which actually doesn't have the idea of marriage anymore, because it hasn't learned how to sublimate instinct and it can't think the idea of marriage. Right. So all of these things are like super important. Is like, why would I study the science of logic? Why would I spend so much time with this incredibly difficult text? Well, your entire life might actually depend on it. Because if you don't actually study logic, you're never going to actually learn how to sublimate instinct, and you're going to be basically a nutcase that needs analysis for the rest of your life. And you're just going to be feeling bigly everywhere, and you're going to see everything as really dangerous when actually it might not be that dangerous. It might just be an idea that you could actually learn something. Right. So all of these things, like, they're connected, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, if philosophy falls out of society, well, we better have some underground theory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe connecting that to a question, and this bringing it back to the idea of the university in the book and Karl Jaspers, is, tell us, who is Karl Jaspers, and why should, if we haven't already sort of made it clear, why should we care about the idea of the university as a book, as a text?
Dave, I'll let you cover.
We're starting with who is Karl Jaspers.
Yeah, maybe Dave, you can cover kind of who Jaspers is, since I think you know a little bit more, and like his relation to some other theorists.
Yeah. So I love everything. I'm glad you brought in the preface there, by the way, right? And I was actually, something I was already going to say was about how Jaspers lacks name recognition in the United States, and that we could have started this off by focusing on Heidegger, Marx, Lacan, Zizek, Deleuze and Guattari, like some of the bigger names. I mean, I could have even gone with Arendt, one of my favorites, but she's also less name brand worthy than these other people I just listed. Jaspers less than her. And I keep saying Jaspers because someone corrected me on it one time when I said Jaspers, and then I looked up online, and it actually said that when I looked up the pronunciation online, it said Jaspers. But then when I just played it a little bit ago, listen,
Karl Jaspers.
So Google tells me that it's Jaspers when I look. So I think that you're saying it correctly.
Google is xenophobic and ethnocentric because it's biased to the Anglophone pronunciation, right? It's picked up the Anglophone pronunciation. It's
Jaspers.
Yeah, but the YouTube pronunciation guide just said it as well, and I think you're right about this.
Oh, Jaspers.
So I don't know who. So here I have been plugging this course, and I've been saying Jaspers because whenever I went to the internet and got confirmation on what that person had told me, that put me under the impression it's definitely Jaspers. But whatever, it's Jaspers. Hey, at the end of the day, even if it was Jaspers, saying Jaspers, which is like people would say that would be an Anglification. Even if it was an Anglification, Anglifications are okay. They're anti-elitist inherently. And so I don't say Kierkegaard or Kierkegaard, I say Kierkegaard, but people say it's Kierkegaard. It's like, okay, well, you say, well. Yeah, we all draw a line somewhere. People say Nietzsche, people say Nietzsche. That one's pretty controversial. Everyone says Kierkegaard. My stance
is that we shouldn't overreact when someone mispronounces a name. Let's just focus on who's the man Karl Jaspers.
Thank you. Yeah. So Karl Jaspers was probably the most influential existentialist in the German scene besides Heidegger. Heidegger and Karl Jaspers are the two fathers of existentialism. Now, obviously, we see there would be no existentialism without Kierkegaard, Pascal, Nietzsche, and to some degree Schopenhauer. So those four, though, make up the tool house or the tool shed, the tools in the tool shed that Jaspers and Heidegger are working with. Now, Heidegger, in Being and Time, barely mentions Kierkegaard explicitly, which is really too bad. And that might be his German ethno-nationalist kind of priorities. People say so. People say that his Eastern influences, his Dutch influences, etc., tend to go unacknowledged, and that he really wants to build up off of the shoulders of specifically German thinkers, and that's fair enough. But obviously, when we think of the parts in Being in Time where Heidegger's talking about Das Man, average everydayness, falling, curiosity, ambiguity, and sort of ironic detachment, and not really having a basis in the things themselves, or trying to, instead just kind of going off of what one says, the scripted nonsense that people tend to inculcate and participate in. That's all coming from Kierkegaard, right? And so Heidegger's making it his own. He's taking all of these existentialists, then he's taking philology, hermeneutics, and he's bringing all these other things into, he's trying to build, I don't want to say synthesize, but he's trying to build a sort of system, a philosophical system that can make sense of all these kind of niche fields and niche insights. And Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, two examples of people who have a lot of insights, but no systematized theory. And what Heidegger does, which really sets him apart and gets him remembered, is the fact that he puts so much thought into how do we bring all this together into a coherent deconstruction of modernity. But the thing is when he does that, he's also piggybacking off of Karl Jaspers or Jaspers. Jaspers is one of the most influential existentialists, but also psychiatrists of the 20th century. So, you know, he does literary criticism, he does philosophy, but he also does psychology. And the fact that he's basically got a doctorate in each of those three things is in itself astonishing and interesting. But then biographically, before we get into his work, biographically, he was married to a Jewish woman, and he did not flee during the occupation of Germany by the Nazi regime. And so he actually kind of, even though he was a pretty well-known public figure, he chose to make a stand and to be against the regime. And if he had suffered consequences, he would have taken that. But he was kind of a big figure, and he played his cards somewhat carefully. And so he ended up not getting killed. But after Nazis were defeated is when he writes The Idea of the University as a series of lectures that are dedicated to one of the presidents of one of the universities in Germany at the time. And the Idea of the University, it says to the so-and-so president, so-and-so in charge or responsible for the reconstruction of the university. Well, why does the university need to be reconstructed? It's because people who were openly anti-Nazi ideology had been weeded out of the university system, and the administration, for the most part, had been fully culpable. He had actually had a significant role in lending some legitimacy to Hitler's regime. And so Jaspers is saying, look, totalitarianism on the one side, from Stalinists and Hitlerists on both sides, the university is constantly suffering from these kind of totalitarian political interests trying to get people to make every course about Marxism, Leninism, or about the German nationalist vision for the future or whatever. And Jaspers is saying, no, like we have to make room for people like that to posit their ideas and be critiqued in public. Otherwise it'll go underground. But we also have to be aware that it's not just the enemies of free thinking and the pursuit of truth is not just going to come from the Nazis or from the Stalinists. It's also going to come from business interests, right? And so that's what he's talking about there. But what he's known for is philosophy of life, right? He was a charismatic and powerful orator. You know, when I think of, I don't just think of him as a theorist, I think of him as probably one of the most influential orators in the university scene. People who went to his lectures were forever changed. And people who went to his lectures, Husserl's lectures, Heidegger's lectures, went on to try to become that themselves. And so though Heidegger and it gets some name recognition or, you know, some engagement from the French, from the post-war French scene, Jaspers doesn't get very much. And the main reason Heidegger gets any at all is because, they all want to find a way to critique him. And usually they critique him on something insubstantial, like Levinas saying Dasein never eats soup. It's in Totality and Infinity. It's actually, I mean, he's getting at something really important, right?
Well, I think one of the strongest criticisms against Heidegger and Dasein is that Dasein seems non-sexual.
Yeah, actually,
being in the world and
yeah. Well, Dasein never has a childhood. Dasein never eats. Dasein doesn't love to eat soup. Dasein
Dasein is not a subject, right? Dasein's not a subject.
Yeah, that's right.
Talking about something maybe post-subjective or something like that, or
it's supposed to be
go too far afield with that. But I think there's so many interesting here connections between Karl Jaspers as a man and sort of like, maybe I like the way you're emphasizing this, so I think I bring it up, is like the difference in their actual orientation to the contingency of being in the country where Nazism took over, and they had different ethical relationships to that event, which is, some people would say, can you read that different ethical stance into their actual philosophical work? Like, and then in regards to Heidegger being mostly a deconstruction of modernity, which does open up the possibility for things to fill that vacuum. You deconstruct modernity, something's going to fill that. It might not necessarily be better than what you deconstructed. Whereas Karl Jaspers, the idea of the university is more of a reconstruction in the mess of that deconstruction. So I think maybe that's an interesting thing to riff on for a bit.
Yeah, and Heidegger had a vision for a renewed, reconstructed kind of university that would not be subservient to science or scientism or technologization or instrumentalization. He had that vision, and he thought the only way to advance that vision was by becoming a rector of the university. And the only, he wouldn't have been able to do anything he did or even attempt to without becoming rector. And to become rector, he had to take on membership in the party. And then later they take away his membership. And while he was there, he stopped people from burning the books by Jewish authors. So it's not like he was just like, I fucking hate Jews, send them all to camps, right? Like, he wasn't like that. No. Though in his Black Notebooks, you do find there is a line in there about international Jewry. So to some degree, he was using that language in his private thought. Now, how serious it went, who knows? But he did take a public stand against the book burnings. And so he's a conflicted character. And I think that it's that conflict. It's on the one side, people read him to be edgy. On the other side, people read him because you get some lefty street cred if you can read Derrida, say how Heidegger influenced Derrida, and then do a Derridian critique of Heidegger. That's some street cred, and rightfully so. And so if you want to get into Foucault, Derrida, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, de Beauvoir, like any of these people, you're going to have to get that basis in Heidegger. The problem is they're not, it's hard to make the same argument with Karl Jaspers. And so that's why I'm saying that he doesn't have that name recognition. It's because he's not as controversial. He's not as sexy or dangerous to struggle with, to fight with, to think through. No one's like sitting there reading between the lines with Jaspers being like, well, what's he really doing here? The most you might find of that is like a Marxist-Leninist. Actually, a good example would be George Lukács thinks that Jaspers is a reactionary romantic figure because he just doesn't like existentialism because it's not Marxist-Leninist. So Jaspers comes into this critique from totalitarian ideology because he's arguing that there needs to be a space that's dedicated to truth-seeking, objectivity, neutrality, allowing different voices and viewpoints that are intolerant to speak. And the totalitarian line is always, oh, well, if you're going to let that person speak, though, then you're supporting that person. And so that is kind of the critique that someone might put against Jaspers, but he doesn't get any more serious engagement than that. And so I don't think Lukács should be the end of the story on this. And that Jaspers, what he is known for, I just want to bring it back to what he's actually known for.
Sure.
It drives me absolutely crazy. This word Weltanschauung, which is the German for worldviews. Yeah. Now, I believe that it's Hegel who really starts saying like philosophy is not just having a Weltanschauung, right? There's a difference between doing philosophy and constructing a worldview, or in a world religions class when they teach all these different worldviews. In a sort of sense, it's like a survey of Weltanschauungs. Yeah, but that's not philosophy, right?
No.
Philosophy is asking the harder questions about what's real, how do we know, what's good, how do we know, okay, well, Jaspers wants to still do a psychology of worldviews. And what drives me crazy is I can't speak enough, or I can't read enough German at this point in my development with German to read him in his original. And his most important book is The Psychology of Worldviews, has not been translated. I'm locked out. And that really sucks. But, one of my bigger goals is to be able to someday read it.
Right on.
But without being able to read that, I would say he's most well known for the lectures and books that he wrote on Nietzsche. One of them being Nietzsche, an introduction to the understanding of his philosophical activity. If it wasn't for that work, Nietzsche would have been forever associated with reactionary German ideas, right? Jaspers came forward as a sort of progressive figure who said, no, there is a wealth of stuff we're thinking about and engaging with here, and that he's not reducible to some bad takes. So that's one of his big things. He also just does the two books, is Reason and Existence with a Z, as well as there's another one about existence. Oh, Philosophy of Existence. These are two of the most fundamental popularizations of the importance of the turn, the post-Hegelian turn that comes through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And so basically, when people think existentialism, they turn to Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They turn to the short book, which was really just lectures by Sartre, called Existentialism as a Humanism, and they turn to the Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. Okay, that's not where to go. The place to go is Reason and Existence, or Philosophy of Existence by Karl Jaspers. And so I in a sort of sense, I can say I've never read him because I haven't read him 3 times. And I think that great philosophy bears repeating. And but I'm at this point where I'm saying, look, I think that existentialism gets pigeonholed as being Sartre's philosophy, or it gets pigeonholed as being absurdism through Camus. Neither of them are half as based in this stuff as Jaspers. And more importantly, Jaspers took that courageous stand. And so I just think that if we're going to go to philosophy and think, okay, but what is existentialism? Then we ought to be reading Jaspers. And if we're going to do Heidegger, great, but do it alongside Jaspers.
One of the interesting things that might be good to bring up here is that when you think of the existentialists, when you think about Kierkegaard, when you think about Nietzsche, when you think about the long lineage that you already brought up there, a lot of the things that come up there, specifically as I would say a Hegelian reaction, is kind of an emphasis on existence over ideas, or an emphasis on existence over logic. And right. I don't really detect that in Jaspers, to be honest. Specifically, he is talking about an idea. He's talking about the university, and he's doing it in a way that seems to more closely wed existence and ideas. And that's also happening on a meta level, like we were talking about, the idea of the university is being situated in a very historical, contingent, contextual moment where that idea needed to be thought, specifically in the reconstruction of university life in Germany. So I think that's another important aspect, is that I think, in my opinion, too much is made of, say, for example, the meta level conflict between a Kierkegaard and a Hegel, or a Schopenhauer and a Hegel, as it relates to existence and ideas. And I definitely appreciated in my reading of Jaspers the way in which he is an existentialist and situated in an existential context, talking about the idea. Mm-hmm. And so just that relationship, that schism, I would say, between existentialism, thinking about raw experience on the one hand, and logic, thinking about, syllogisms, mathematics, mechanisms, those things, there needs to be, I would say, in a Hegelian sense, a more unity of the opposites when it comes to those two dimensions of life. Like Jaspers actually made a point, and this is a problem with like perhaps the historical field of maths or the historical field of logic. But he says, except mathematicians and logicians, everyone needs regular contact with experience. And I think that, from a science of logic point of view, I think Hegel would say even logicians, in terms of the coming to be of their notion, need contact with experience, or else it's just dead abstraction. So yeah, just getting those two, dimensions to be thought dialectically, I think is important. And I don't know if you have anything to say about your sort of experience with reading Karl Jaspers, or if you had anything you wanted to say in relationship to this conversation.
Yeah, I just think, you had initially asked, like, why is this text important? I think something that we've kind of touched on throughout our conversation is like ideas. An idea of something is so important. If we lose that, like, we're lost. And so thinking about the idea of the university versus just like the university and how it currently exists will then help us think about, like, thinking of the idea helps us think about how it currently exists. Thinking about the idea of the university really puts into perspective why having an institution for seeking truth and the pursuit of knowledge and the unifying of all of these different fields is important, and why it should be, like, why it should exist. And so as someone who like genuinely believes in the pursuit of truth and knowledge and who wants to have these difficult conversations, I am like upset that I didn't encounter the idea of the university in any of my university classes. Like, I'm so happy I finally found it and can use it to kind of back up what I already believe, but then also really understand it in all of its nuances and kind of have a better idea for, what the university should look like. And it really just, I think, builds some hope for like why there should be college, like why we should go, and kind of in that practical sense, it's just hopeful for, well, there is an idea. So long as that idea is talked about and discussed, there is hope for the university. And so I'm really excited to kind of get to continue talking about it with you and Bryan, who has his own experiences, and then Dave, obviously, and whoever else wants to join the class, because we all obviously have our critiques of the university, but then kind of using those along with Jaspers' ideas will just be really useful to kind of conceptualize a university and truth seeking in our society.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that there's another aspect of what you were both talking about in regards to, and specifically, Dave, you were bringing up this philosophy is not a worldview, and that this I think bears repeating in our context, because I do often feel like what happens with the culture wars is that what's going on are there are worldviews in competition, like whatever those worldviews are, but actually philosophy is not a worldview, is that it's more of a way of knowing, or a way of approaching thought, or a way of thinking, as opposed to a worldview or a systemic structure. And what do you think that this idea, how do you think this idea impacts perhaps the way you want to teach, or the types of discussions you want to facilitate, and the type of like life you want to cultivate, let's say, or discussions you want to cultivate at Theory Underground, and specifically here, maybe inspired by Karl Jaspers as a foundation?
You're really good at this, like, interviewing thing. You're asking really good questions. These are questions that, like, I'm like, my God, no one's just ever asked me that. No one's just asked me that point blank.
Dave, what do you think, Dave? What do you think about the ultimate nature of reality? Like, can you give us a little soundbite?
Yeah, let me actually give you the quick and dirty here. So I have a Substack still under NS Plebe. I'll probably change the name of it to Theory Underground when I get around to it. But I put a blog post out on that like 3 months ago, and this blog post is somewhere on my website, hard to find. I have to do a little working it out to make it accessible. I'll promise to do it this weekend. Okay. But the title is something about like theory versus ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And, people use philosophy and theory interchangeably when that, even Zizek sometimes uses them interchangeably. And I'm not so sure I want to do that, because theory is almost always a lot more like having a sense for what needs to be done or developed theoretically, and then putting everything into developing that, having a certain set of operating assumptions in place. And usually the operating assumptions, some of them are explicit, other ones are just implicit and maybe unbeknownst to the author. And so the difference between theory and ideology in this sense is that a theorist has to have operating assumptions, explicit and implicit. But after that theorist dies and people have had to fight to keep that person's name alive for others, those operating assumptions stop being operating assumptions and become dogmas. At the point that they become dogmas, and this is, you see this especially in psychoanalysis in the aftermath of Freud, but Marxism is a perfect example of it as well. He had a lot of operating assumptions in play. Some were onto something, some were not onto something. Some made sense when he was writing, others don't make sense anymore. But then you have people arguing about what the orthodox Marxist take is, instead of trying to think, would he have come to this conclusion today? And more importantly, should we? Right? Like that's not even a question anymore. And so for me, the difference comes down to thinking fundamental questions and developing an intimate relation to concepts, learning to live through concepts and see and process through concepts, versus memorizing what one who believes X, Y, and Z is supposed to say. Or like, for instance, any ism. If there's an ism, then, I'm a realist. I believe in realism, or I believe in materialism, or I believe in idealism, or I believe in utilitarianism, or I believe in deontology. All of these are examples of isms that come out of philosophy, but become dogmatic, ideological worldviews, where people go to philosophy class, basically they find out that there's this age-old distinction between empiricism and rationalism, between utilitarianism and deontology. And then they think the task is to come up with their own unique position in that binary. You either take a hard side on one of the two sides, or you take up some kind of a stance between the two. Oh, free will versus determinism. Perfect example. Okay. Well, you're saying, to bring it back to your question, how does this influence my teaching or how I approach these things with others? For me, the question is never which ism are you committed to or are you here to defend? And if a person comes in with that mindset, it usually makes things difficult for us to do what we're actually there to do, which is primarily thinking. And I believe that an important part of thinking is rigorously working through seeing the world on the shoulders of some other great thinker, right? Because nothing makes us better than being around masters, people who've mastered some topic. And no one's mastered thinking about being as much as Heidegger when it comes to being, like thinking the difference between tools, horses, trees, rocks, God, angels, people. These are all different senses of being, yet they're all being conflated by philosophers. Okay, so someone spends their entire life engaging with all the greatest minds, but thinking nobody's thought this question through thoroughly enough. Okay, I can spend the rest of my life dabbling in that question, or I can get on the shoulders of someone who took that seriously for his entire life, right? Well, nothing's going to accelerate me as a thinker faster than doing it with the great thinker who focused on that kind of a question. If you want to think lack, you go to Lacan. No one thought lack in all of its nuance and how our subjectivity is structured by certain fundamental forms of lack more than him. Sartre for nothingness. Everyone has their thing. And the question is, I think the question should not be, am I a Sartrean? Am I a Heideggerian? Am I a Marxist? That's something academics ask themselves so they can figure out which journals they want to publish in, so they can figure out what conferences they want to go to, so they can figure out which kind of cocktail parties they want to be at. But if we're trying to think doing philosophy, for me, I think that would mean it's not about finding your ism. And I would say the longer you can hold off on doubling down on an ism, the better you are. And so I advocate for a time of moratorium, for a time of questioning, for a time of saying, I'm an apprentice. I'm just trying to learn from the greats right now. Thank you.
And anything you want to add to that sermon?
Yeah, maybe not to that whole thing, but in thinking about kind of my own approach to like teaching in the future, to using Jaspers' ideas, you know, he talks about in kind of the first part of the book, first like half of the book, really like the importance of research and method in the pursuit of knowledge and truth. And so I think like thinking about like my own future, that's something I think I'll definitely take more seriously in terms of like teaching, especially. I mean, I'd love to one day teach in a high school setting, kind of like Bryan, and something that Bryan does, he had mentioned in our little meeting live stream that we had a few days ago that I admire so much, kind of how he approaches the classroom with what he knows, kind of with his philosophical background. He's an English teacher, but he tells his students at the beginning of the class, in his English class, this isn't going to be useful to you in your career. Nothing that I'm teaching you is useful in the instrumentalized sense. It is purely for your own good, for your own knowledge. So like do with that what you will. And that is something that I like attempted to do in this university class that I taught, was really start them off with, hey, like I'm here to help you, to be in dialogue with you, to use your brains. And maybe that wasn't as well received in that setting, but I think using these ideas to just hopefully like try to help others like understand where I'm coming from and just help them realize like, yeah, this maybe isn't useful to your future job, but I'm here because this matters to like my own humanity and my own self-actualization. And I want it to matter to you too. And if you want to go on this like intellectual journey with me, then you can, and we'll talk about hard things. And I'm going to treat you like an equal intellectual and not like a student, not like I'm better than you. We are in a dialogue here, and do with that what you will. And I think my kind of teaching attitude because of that is very relaxed. I don't like to require things of people. You're either going to do it or you're not, and you're going to get an F, or you're going to try, and like I'll kind of, grade you on how I see you put in effort, but trying to like change the narrative. So I'm not trying to teach, I'm not trying to, brainwash you in social science and sociology, which is kind of a dialogue narrative in the United States. I'm not trying to force you to learn something. I'm just here to like foster your own journey. Do with that what you will. And so Jaspers really helps me like think about how to do that, and think about in relation to professors and teachers that I've had in the past, and how did they do this well? How did they not do this well? Where were they kind of aligning with the perspectives and ideals that Jaspers puts forward, and where were they maybe more on the instrumentalized neoliberal side?
All right, that's fantastic. And actually, I was gonna ask you guys what was your pitch, what's your final pitch for the course? But I think, Anne, I think you both did a good job of framing sort of a nice reason for, or at least a part of why you might entertain taking the course. But maybe some final reflections then. So like, the idea of the university starts, and I'll definitely leave a link in the description.
Saturday.
I'm going to leave a link in the description to the YouTube video here, so you can sign up to the course. It starts this Saturday, like you're saying there, Dave, January 14th, and it runs for just over a month. Is that correct? It ends February 18th.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
from the
Okay.
14th
So
to the
yeah, so
18th.
you got a course here diving into Karl Jaspers, the idea of the university. Starts this Saturday, January 14th, ends February 18th. You're going to have it taught by Dave and another teacher, Bryan. Is that his name?
Mhm, mhm.
Bryan. And you can find out all that information on the Theory Underground website, which will be linked below. So other than that information, and I'll be taking the course as well. So if you're interested in diving in and having deeper conversations about this, just like I think the types of conversations we're going to be having might not be that dissimilar from the types of conversations you've been listening to over the last 2 hours. So maybe final takeaway from both of you. Are you looking forward to teaching the course, and what are you looking forward to learning from either the book, deeper engagement, rereadings, and the students?
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying I'm just excited to like finally have an outlet to really have these rigorous conversations about truth and knowledge, since I feel like I didn't fully get that in my university experience. I admire like everyone who's either teaching the class or has signed up so far. I really admire everyone's backgrounds, like you, Cadell, and Dave, obviously, and Bryan too. And he just got his master's in education, and his thesis was like right along these lines. So it'll be really great to kind of hear everyone's perspectives and experiences, and then how like everyone synthesizes the information. And so I'm just excited to kind of like go on this journey, being someone who's, I think, relatively new to like theory, philosophy teaching compared to like you three. And like whoever else might take the course, I'm probably on the younger end. And so I have a lot to learn, but I definitely am excited for the discussion of it. So I really hope that we get a few more people to sign up, because it's just going to be like a really important kind of foundational conversation for the Theory Underground, why we're doing that, why we care about learning. Like we're not just, oh, the nerds who like to read philosophy, like why it matters to us. So I'm looking forward to it.
We are also that, though. We are
also that. Oh, for sure. For sure.
We are. Well, let's not.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And Dave, what about you?
To wrap it up, I would just say that
No
Bryan
pressure.
Weeks-
No, you already said you're not Jesus. You're not.
Yeah,
You're not here to save us here.
Yeah, no, it's that is actually true. I feel a lot less pressure because of the way this is set up. It was, with Theory Plebe, because that was kind of my nickname or alias, everything I did made it kind of about me or what my take is. And so one of the nice things about the Theory Underground is that it's like, yeah, I'm a catalyst. I make things happen. I organize like you do. But it's not about my takes. It's not about me influencing other people in any way, shape, or form, except to do it themselves. Right. And so, but Bryan Weeks is the person who Anne's referenced a couple of times in this conversation so far. He's not present. He and I have led a variety of discussion groups. We've done lectures. We've held our own events in Boise, Idaho, where we were both living, through a variety of proto organizations, and various, attempts at starting something kind of like this. This is just the most recent iteration of this idea. And I love Bryan. I think everyone else will as well. He's a very contemplative, thoughtful person who comes from a creative writing and poetry background, who got really into philosophy because of me. When I was living with him and I was reading Being in Time and I would talk about it all the time, he was like, I've never done philosophy. I think the time is to dive in right now. So I bought Being in Time, and I was like, you've never done philosophy, but you're going to read Being in Time? Not a good idea. And he's like, I don't care. I'm going to do it. And he, like us, gets his jouissance from difficult texts and being able to make sense of them. And so, he's still really into literature, and he's writing his own books and stuff right now, but he's like 6 years into philosophy now, and he read a ton of phenomenology last year. And so now he's getting into Jaspers because of this reading. He started reading some of Jaspers' other work. And so what I would say, outside of having so many educators involved that will be bringing their own experiences into the thing, I'm really excited to learn more about Jaspers from Bryan as we go, because a part of he says, Jaspers keeps talking about truth, but he never actually says what he means by truth in this whole book. And so he's reading a bunch of other Jaspers stuff so that in our conversations and lectures in this course, we'll be able to learn some of the details about Jaspers' broader philosophy. And I'll be bringing in some of the stuff from his work on philosophy of history. So that's, I'm just excited for us to all become either Jasperians or to figure out why we're not Jasperians. I people know why they're not Deleuzian, or people know why they're not X, Y, or Z, but I'm sorry, I want Jaspers to have a bigger role in the reconstitution of the idea of the university itself, since he obviously put his life on the line and tried to make it happen for his entire existence.
Yeah, it's really interesting, to be honest, because I didn't really have I knew his name, but I actually didn't have any understanding of his work before hearing about your course, and I've really enjoyed the book. Well, first, thank you for bringing my attention and awareness to an aspect of philosophy that I had no idea about, and I'm definitely excited just spontaneously to think about the idea of the university. I think it's, for me, obviously close to the heart, in the sense of, falling in love with the university, it being an important part of my intellectual life. At the same time, living in an age where I feel like it has kind of lost its concept, lost its idea. And so, doing sort of underground stuff to keep that idea alive, like you said, like if someone's searching for truth and they don't find it in the university, they're going to drop out, but that idea is not going to die. And I think that, at least for me, going into the course, taking the course with you guys, it's, I suppose, a part of the larger process of keeping that idea alive and making it more concrete. And, and I think that's going to be a really fun adventure. And so thanks for coming on to have this conversation. I think it opened up your historical context for me. It gave me a deeper insight into why this book is important now in this moment of Theory Underground, and thanks for the people who have been watching. So with that, I'm going to end the video recording, and everyone sign up to the Idea of the University starting this Saturday, January 14th. Link in the description. We're out.
Cool.
Peace.
Thank you.